responsible for the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. How was he able to get that arsenal into the Mandalay Bay resort without anyone noticing? Why do mass shootings seem to happen now more often than decades ago? And how do you protect people who were simply outside enjoying a night of country music? And those are not even the most obvious questions that we'll leave for later. Joining us for more is former Sarasota Police Chief Pete Abbott, Dr. James Univer, a professor of criminology and sociology at USF Sarasota Manatee, and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. Thank you all for joining us on really what is a difficult night for not just Las Vegas, but our entire country. And Chief, let me start with you. We've become used to, if you're going to a concert or going to a sporting event, going through security to get there. That's become a fact of our lives. But how do you protect somebody in an open air venue from somebody who would do this 30 stories over the scene?
You don't, and you saw what the result of that was. There are so many precautions you can take, and if somebody really wants to do damage, as you saw in France, as you saw in London, as you've seen in Orlando, there's a lot of different ways they could do it. Planes, bombs, trains, trucks. If somebody wants to give their life, they can usually do a lot of damage. And the fact that these folks that were at the concert weren't even in the same venue as he was in. He was across the street and in a high-rise. It's very, very difficult to stop that if they're bent on it.
Doctor, I'm going to ask you a question which I don't know if you can answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You know, I printed out all the mass shootings in modern U.S. history dating back to the early 1950s. Some of them are on the screen if you could put them up, but they start, back in the early 1980s, and there were others in the 1950s and the 1960s, but they were infrequent. Yes. Now, it almost seems that we have it just about every year, and I'm wondering if experts like yourself look at why.
Well, I would think that the greatest cause for the increase is the collapse of our mental health system. Everybody talks about how the institutions were basically depopulated and the communities had no health care in place to take these people who were being vacated out of the mental institutions. And the reality is, as we're even seeing with the opiate addiction, the mental health facilities are just unavailable.
But that doesn't explain shootings like this one. I mean, there's a lot we have to learn about this guy.
Right.
But as far as we know now, he has never been adjudicated mentally ill. His brother, who lives in Orlando, said there was nothing in this guy's history that would see this coming. He was a successful accountant. He was a wealthy man.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the number one best predictor of criminal behavior is family history of criminal behavior. And the one thing, it's hard to kind of cherry pick what this guy's past, what happened to him, but the reality is, I don't believe that this man had, the Wally Cleaver, Leave It to Beaver household. From what we understand, his father was on the run, was on the FBI, and certainly we know, at least in the models I run in regression.
But no history of violent crime until his 60s, which is strange. Susan, this is an argument best for another day, or at least so I'm told. But you do see already those folks who say, look, we got to talk about the underlying issue of gun violence here and the availability of guns. This is, we're not going to get that fully into tonight, but you see both sides already at least starting to talk about it.
I don't know when we're not talking about it. We may take a break in between, but we've had mass shootings almost every year, if not every other year, since as long as I can remember. And so the conversation actually doesn't stop. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes to either address it no matter which side you're on. So I don't want to, it's hard not to politicize an event like this, and I don't think we should surmise anything about the shooter until we find more details. I think we need to take a look at ourselves as a country and say, why is it that these things don't occur in any other nation let alone as one as advanced as ours, as they do here in the United States.
All right, we are just getting started. We're just getting warmed up. We'll have much more on the mass shooting in Las Vegas right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. Until today, the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando had been the dubious distinction of being the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. Now it's Las Vegas. At least 59 dead, over 500 injured. And joining us for more is former Sarasota Police Chief Peter Abbott, Dr. James Univer, a professor of criminology and sociology at USF Sarasota Manatee, and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. Chief, the reports we have is that law enforcement reacted incredibly fast. We still don't know how long the entire event lasted, but it does show you that even with a lightning quick response of law enforcement, a lot of damage can be done in a short period of time.
Absolutely. If somebody has a weapon or a device, they can wreak a lot of havoc and reap a lot of carnage in a very short period of time. I think one of the things that's probably going to be done now is to go back and look at what this relationship this gentleman had, what his financial condition was, what his emotional condition was. I hope they'd be able to do an autopsy on his brain to see if there's any damage there. There's a lot of questions, and it's so early, after the event to really speculate. But just our thoughts and prayers go out to those folks out in Vegas.
Dr. Univer, we have a lot of questions, but we also know a lot of things. I mean, this was not an act of terrorism or Islamic, extremism. These were not stolen firearms, as we know. When you look at some of these mass shootings over history, are there common things about those who perpetrated them that kind of come to the surface?
Yes. There's probably at least 3 or 4 commonalities. One is, generally speaking, they're all white, and most of us associate violence with being black, so this is kind of a different way to view who this typical person is that's violent. The research that came out of the Columbine shootings is really quite interesting. None of the participants in all the school shootings that they've studied, it was a study I think done by the Secret Service actually, showed that none of them particularly had any kind of strong mental illnesses. They weren't psychotic, they weren't sociopaths. The one thing that they all had in common in terms of the school shootings is that they were all bullied at one point or another. So that they felt frustrated about that. They were picked on. And the other thing that I think that we could all be really attentive to is the other thing that they found out in those school shootings is that every one of them had notified in some way or another someone, whether it was via Facebook or through a text or whatever it may be, that they were planning some sort of mass shooting. So, maybe the best line of defense, besides taking maybe weapons out of psychotic people's hands, but once again, these students were not, is somehow or another for us to be more attentive that when we hear these ranting and ravings that we take it seriously.
Yeah. I want to address that though, because a lot of times these notes are left for family members or to loved ones. They're not generally broadcast to the public, and 9 out of 10 times when you get something from someone that you care about, that you can't imagine them doing something like that, you're not going to turn around and say, oh, we could have a serious problem. And then sometimes you do, but then the law enforcement, when you go to law enforcement and say, I'm concerned about my brother or my uncle, they also downplay it as well. It's not an easy thing. You look at social media today. How many things do we say that you go, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have said it, and yet we publicize it?
Well, let me ask you a tough question about that, because when and this guy was not adjudicated, mentally ill. We obviously, this act in and of itself is an insane act, but when it comes to the debate over the mentally ill and their access to firearms, there is disagreement. You have civil libertarians who say that you cannot take even firearms away from people who are judged mentally ill. There are some states that you can only do so if it is adjudicated, and that happens very rarely. Yeah, so it's a hard call. The Second Amendment was intended to
keep a government that has gone wrong at bay and allow the citizens to protect themselves. And I think most of the panelists would agree that it doesn't take an assault rifle to protect yourself. You can do it with a regular rifle, you know, a shotgun, whatever. I think the difference is what we're missing in this conversation is that we have a for-profit industry that plays upon the weaknesses of Americans, the fears of Americans, that actually help not only publicize but also romanticize owning a gun. You take a look at the stocks of gun makers today, and immediately they went up. People get a fear that a bill is going to be passed and assault rifles are going to be banned. What do? They run out and buy more assault rifles.
Right. Chief, you know, you could talk and say that the answer is take away the tools that allow these mass shootings to take place, but your point is that if it wasn't a firearm, it may well, especially with our emerging technology, be something else.
Could be a plane, which we saw in 9/11. It could be a truck, which happened in the south of France. It could be a bomb, which happened at the Ariana Grande.
It could be a drone.
It has nothing to do with the device, really doesn't. If somebody wants to kill somebody, they can do it. It's trying to figure out what's going on in their heads and their hearts that's more important. But there are 300 million Americans plus, 6 billion people in the world. You see these things, they're outliers, but they're there. And they affect everybody. And the fact that everyone becomes an instant celebrity now on the internet worldwide for doing these things is not helping.
Doctor, that leads us back to our original question. These weapons have been around since the turn of the last century. We've had trucks, we've had knives. Why does it seem that this is happening more and more often? What is different now than it was in the 1960s?
Well, I mean, the reality is that more people do own guns now than they did when we were young. When I was young, people owned guns, but generally speaking, they owned them to go hunting. And they didn't own, like Susan was saying, automatic weapons. So, you know, there's certainly been a growth in that industry in terms of these automatic weapons or semi-automatic that apparently this fellow was able to transform into an automatic weapon. So, you know, there's a little bit of research. It's not overwhelmingly convincing that there is a sense of copycat, that, you know, there's people kind of like research is now showing that depression may be have a contagious effect. So I think there's a whole lot of combination of factors that, you know, I don't think we're going to have a single factor tell us exactly what the problem is here.
Susan, the sense that I get today is that whatever side you are on the gun debate, there is an incredible amount of frustration out there. You know, those people who support Second Amendment rights, by and large, are fairly quiet today, and people who want gun control in some fashion or form really don't know what to say anymore.
No. Yeah, I don't know what to say anymore. I saw the news this morning and I was speechless all day. I think there has to be a conversation that goes beyond further. It's not just about the rights to own a gun. It's also about the responsibility of owning a gun. It's the responsibility of the manufacturers and the NRA who only push one side. It's only that you have to have a gun. But owning a gun comes with the responsibility that everybody's going to be owning a gun. Then what happens? Where do we start to take control over accidents or
Chief,
issues?
Let me try to get this in a short period of time, because there are a lot of responsible gun owners out there, but these mass killings are done by irresponsible, mentally ill people. There's no way that you could get a person, whether it's under a threat of a death penalty or life in prison, to refrain from doing something if they are mentally ill.
If they're mentally ill, if they're going through an emotional challenge, if they're
Just angry?
in a relationship, financially bankrupt, there's a lot of reasons why people reach the end of their rope. I think it's wise to wait to find out what those reasons were, and they may reveal themselves in the next few days. There are no easy answers. I've been on both sides of this equation. I know people who save people's lives with guns. I know people who have taken their lives with guns. There's not an easy answer to it, but I think what needs to be done is you've got to find out what the commonalities are, if they are mentally ill, if they do have these problems, you got to have rules in effect that will keep them away. And I think the problem is, this guy, if he didn't have evidence any mental health issues,
wouldn't
he'd
be able to help
be able
him.
to walk in and get this gun anyway. So I think it's a much deeper problem than that, unfortunately.
Okay, we have to take a quick break, and we'll return with final thoughts in a moment. Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Chief, you raised a lot of questions in terms of looking at this individual and his mental state and background and try to figure out what is going on there. What else is law enforcement to learn from this in terms of how to respond to, it seems like this is yet a new set of circumstances.
Well, after Columbine, the response changed dramatically from wait to see what happens to actively go in and try to save as many lives as you can, and that's a very risky business, and apparently the Las Vegas police did that very quickly. And you know, when you go in that door and the guy's got an automatic weapon, whoever goes in that door first, there's a very good chance they're going to be shot. They may not be killed if they have the right body armor, but they're going to be shot. And from that perspective, I'm very proud of what law enforcement did. There are troubled people in the world. That's why we have laws, and that's why we have police. If there were no problems, we wouldn't need these laws to live by.
I guess it just came out that he had 18 weapons in the room. And the obvious question is this something that somehow should have been noticed entering the hotel?
You would hope to, but you can break down a weapon into a suitcase or a duffel bag and you would never notice. If he had 4 or 5 suitcases or ammunition, he could have done this over a course of days. He could have been in his car and he could have made trips back and forth. He checked in on a Thursday. He took action on a Sunday. There's a lot of time for him to do this.
Dr. Univer, from a criminologist and a sociologist point of view, how do you handle and what do you want to look for in yet a completely different kind of circumstance for a mass murder?
Well, I mean, once again, what you try to do is create a pool of all the people that have done this, and then you look for patterns that emerge from that data pool. What's the commonality that these people share? And like I said, with the school shootings, what they did share that they all had in common was that they were all bullied. And also that they reached out to somebody, you know, through some social media. So I suspect that pattern, though, with, you know, there's not a large N, so to speak, but I have a feeling that this guy may fit that pattern.
And Susan, finally, with the debate, are we just going to revert into our familiar patterns?
Probably. Because you're going to get lawmakers who are going to stick their heel in the ground and say it doesn't matter. You know, I'm going to keep my agenda. You're going to get the NRA who will wait a couple of days and then send out their condolences and then get right on the bandwagon about how we need to have more guns. And then you're going to get gun manufacturers who are going to tell you that they're not responsible for how guns are used. They just provide a service. So I think somebody needs to have a lot more guts and a lot more foresight. And we're all really good at Monday morning quarterbacking, but we never actually take responsibility.
And so it goes. Thank you all. FYI, you can watch past discussions. They're on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. Former Sarasota Police Chief Peter Abbott, Dr. James Univer, a professor of criminology and sociology at USF Sarasota Manatee, and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. When we return,